Welcome everyone to the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University and our weekly research seminar. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director, and it is a great pleasure to introduce today our guest speaker. Meg Gulliford is a Penn Provost Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, associated with Perry Worldhouse. Her research focuses on political violence, conflict processes, and U.S. foreign policy. And she's here today to talk to us about her research on Civil War non-recurrence, where she'll be looking at the work that she's done on El Salvador and the non-recurrence of civil war in that case. Meg Gulliford not only has a scholarly career as a PhD candidate in Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, but she's also served in the federal government. In the past, she was a presidential management fellow at the U.S. Marine Corps headquarters, and she also worked under the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence at the Pentagon. So somebody who has looked at both the academic and policy dimensions of conflict. We're very much looking forward to having her talk about her research today. Meg Gulliford will first present her research for about 30 or so minutes, 35 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A. This is a webinar, so please enter your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. And when we come back from the presentation, I'll go ahead and manage the Q&A for everyone. And just as a reminder, I may prioritize some of our CSAC pre and postdoctoral fellows. We have a custom where we let them ask the first couple of questions. And just because we're virtual doesn't mean we're going to stop the custom. But without much further ado, please, Meg Gulliford, over to you.
Thank you so much, Harold. I really appreciate being with y'all today. I do love that tradition of allowing pre and postdoctoral fellows to go first, because that's where I am now. So I like to be heard, and so that's my thing. The work that I'm presenting to y'all today is an older project, yet it's still early stage qualitative work. This project is derived from when I started considering my cases for my dissertation. I looked specifically at El Salvador in a subnational context, but I kept going back and forth with this project as to whether or not I wanted to explain if I sought to explain Civil War non-recurrence overall, or to explain Civil War non-recurrence in El Salvador. And ultimately, I decided on the latter and came up with the following quite straightforward research question. Hold on a second, my computer isn't working here. There we go. So what explains the lack of Civil War recurrence in El Salvador since the 1992 Chapultepec Accords? What we know is in El Salvador, what we're trying to figure out is that how has the country avoided fully falling back into civil war, and how does it keep civil war at bay? That's what I'm trying to understand. This is a phenomenon that does not lend itself to monocausal explanations. Overall, I've identified 4 explanatory factors, and this is my primary argument, these 4 factors. First is the third-party guarantor. And in this case, what I'm looking at really is, who's going to make sure everybody plays nicely with each other? Security sector reform, in this case, it's how do you make security? How do you ensure that the country is safe? Power sharing, this is really the participation trophy of explanations. Does everyone feel like they're involved? Chuck Call refers to it as inclusion. It's language I also mirror in my dissertation project. And the final factor is the organizational design of the FMLN. While that is outside the scope of many of the overarching explanations that scholars have identified about Civil War recurrence, in this case, it's really important, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but just keep that in mind when I walk through and talk about the FMLN, the rebel group FMLN. So as a roadmap, I'm gonna walk you through, this presentation proceeds in 5 parts. I'm going to identify the risk factors for Civil War recurrence that we find in scholarship, outline my methodological approach that I use for this. I'm going to introduce the case. El Salvador is a very unique Civil War case. It is the one that is, of course, closest to my heart. I'm going to introduce the evidence that I base my argument and final assumption, and my findings on, and then talk about those implications for both policy and practice, right? But before moving forward, I want to take a moment for a little bit of conceptualization. When I'm talking about peace, I'm not equating peace with the absence of violence, but rather in the tradition of negative peace, in which there's an absence of war. El Salvador, as many people on this call might know, is not a place that you would say is peaceful. However, in scholarship, we would refer to, in political violence scholarship, we refer to it often as peaceful because there is no threat to the state. That is something else I will also talk about as we advance through this presentation. So when we talk about the risk factors for recurrence, there are 6 that overall in the literature we found. Those are security sector reform. And what we mean here is laying down arms, like the cessation of fighting. Power sharing, this really has both a political and military dimension. Foreign aid, has the state grown dependent on external support? This is something I discuss specifically in my dissertation. That is the major thrust of the project. And is it necessary? Is that external support necessary for the continuation of peace? When we talk about third-party guarantors, how do states overcome mistrust? There's actually, Melissa Lee has some forthcoming work that's really interesting where she challenges a lot of the credible commitment assumptions that are made in IR, which is a very interesting piece that I'd encourage everyone to take a look at. The nature of the issues under dispute. Why are these parties fighting? And spoilers, these are the actors, domestic actors. In this case, it's really important to acknowledge that these are the domestic actors. And here we're talking about, does peace threaten their interests? So methodologically, I use process tracing to work through the risk factor variables. I did this using I started with a comprehensive literature review of both academic and policy work and arrived at these 6 factors that I've just introduced to you. And I process trace along these variables to identify a sequence of actions and resultant developments to assess each of the explanations as to whether or not they actually explain non-recurrence in El Salvador. The origins of my evidence come largely from archives. I'm very much an archival researcher. I've spent some time at the Hoover Institute's archives. The last several years have been really hard on me because they've been closed much of that time, but I was able to actually get some information from them. And then also archives that are in El Salvador. So the Museum of the Word and Image, the University of Central America, and others. I have a series of ex-combatant interviews, and these are, I've not been able to actually at this point integrate my interviews with government combatants, but FMLN combatants from each of the 5 groups, I've been able to do that, and then secondary source investigation. In addition to these, I've also been able to use oral histories from the US military. The Center for Justice and Accountability has trial transcripts and expert testimony from folks like Terry Carl that have been very, very helpful in my work in El Salvador. So that is the methodological approach that I take. So just to give you a little bit of context about the Salvadoran Civil War. It was a 12-year endeavor. It was brutal. The origins of it actually go back to the late 19th century. But what is really important to understand is that as of 1932, with a massacre known as La Matanza, that is when El Salvador started about 50 years of military rule. It is the point at which the military came to power and maintained power at the behest of the oligarchy, or the 14 largely known as the 14 families in El Salvador that controlled pretty much everything in the state. And what you find here is that it was a fight between the FMLN and the excuse me, and the Salvadoran government and security forces from the Salvadoran government. Those include an array of actors that we'll talk about a little bit in a little bit. But just so you know, there are cleanly one rebel group. We'll talk about those intricacies, and the government, and fighting against the government in a very bloody civil war. So the conflict actors, as we see them, excuse me, sorry, I have to get a tissue. The conflict actors, as we know them to be, are the government and the FMLN. Like I said, the FMLN is a consolidated umbrella organization. It was actually 5 rebel groups that came together in 1980, largely as a way to consolidate their resources. It's often, Fidel Castro is often given a lot of credit for pushing them to consolidate, but it's probably something that would have happened anyway. So you have these 5 groups that came together to fight. What's interesting about them is that they were never fully one organization. And that's really important because they maintained their own resources with respect to money, weapons, and often their external supporters would only support one of those conflict actors. So the Soviet Union was very focused on supporting the Communist Party of El Salvador, whereas other groups, Nicaragua and Cuba, were focused on the groups known as the ERP and the FPL. But in one of my interviews that was one of my interviews with ex-combatants, several of them really focused on that lack of unity, what they perceived as the lack of unity. And one gave a very interesting comment in which he said, the FMLN was never a fist. Instead, it was a hand with 5 fingers. And that becomes really important for how they operated and how they move forward. On the other side, you have the government of El Salvador. And in the government of El Salvador, you have a highly repressive government that had been that way for about 50 years. And these quotes show you that, in the words of the Locks and Wu-Tang Clan, for the government, they were very focused on remaining in power. What they cared about above all was remaining in power. And then for the oligarchy, they cared about money, how they made money, and what happened. And these 2 quotes really demonstrate that, as particularly the hubris of the oligarchy. For them, they felt as though the government could not function without them, that the country could not function without them. And so these are the actors you have. But I'm really going to focus on the end of the Civil War, and it was really about how they got to the negotiating table. In 1989, the war started actually with the FMLN actually military superiority in a position of military superiority over the government. They were never able to break the government militarily, but they were, for several years, they were much more militarily advanced than the government. But over the course of this Civil War, which ran from 1980 to 1992, the government reached parity, largely because of the external support from the United States. From 1980 to about 1989, the United States government gave over $5 billion worth of external support, whether that be economic support, development support, or military support to the government of El Salvador. So they were able to advance and come to parity with the FMLN. And in 1989, the FMLN initiated what they called the final offensive. They also had one of these in 1981 that didn't work out so well. But in 1989, they initiated a final offensive, and that was really focused on getting to specific areas in San Salvador and holding them for quite some time. While they were unable to fully accomplish what they wanted in that offensive. It was not wholly successful militarily, but it did bring about a breach in the oligarchy military protection racket, which is what the term that William Stanley uses to speak about the relationship between the oligarchy and military. Because what happened in this circumstance was the FMLN was actually able to get into very specific neighborhoods in San Salvador, excuse me, that they'd never breached before. And those are the neighborhoods in which the oligarchy lived. So it really raised the oligarchy's suspicions that the government could not actually protect it any longer, that there was that the government could not, that the government, and in this case, the armed forces, could not actually hold up their end of the bargain to ensure that the oligarchy's interests and safety were at the forefront of everything they did. And this quote from the UN mediator, the UN's lead mediator for the peace agreement, really talks about how they'd reached what in IR we call a herding stalemate, that the only thing that could happen if fighting continued was that they were just going to keep killing each other, and neither party could win militarily. So neither party could win militarily, and the FMLN could not raise the civilian support to actually instigate the insurrection, the level of insurrection that they needed or that they wanted. So the road to Chapultepec began, and it was a series of 6 agreements that led to that point, starting with the Geneva Agreement through the New York Agreement, that started with outlining the basic rules and frameworks and ended with how are we going to reform? How are we going to reform the armed forces, the security apparatus in El Salvador? So you see all of these steps. It was not as of 1992, hey, here's your agreement. There was a process, and the UN walked them through this process. There's a UN mediation team, as I said, led by Ambassador De Soto, that really shepherded this process. They were, when we're used to seeing like preschool or kindergartners, they were leading them across the street with the rope to be like, hey, we're going to get to a peace agreement, and this is what we're, just keep following us, keep pushing us, just keep pushing forward, we can do this. And so you see over the course of these 2 years how they got there, right? So when we think about this empirically of what we should see, if each of these variables were to predict Civil War non-recurrence in El Salvador, these are what we should see. So with security sector reform, the ceasefire is going to hold. Everything that was decided about the security sector reform, all the reforms there would hold. Force structure provisions. What's interesting here is that what you're going to see is this is really about what should be included and then implemented there, included in the settlement agreements, and then actually then implemented. What we saw, interestingly enough, is that the resolution of the nature of the issues under dispute, which were highly socioeconomic, like this was a socioeconomic fight. This was not about religion, ethnicity. It was very much about socioeconomic and justice for peasant communities and otherwise peasant communities and the like. You don't see any of those issues actually addressed in the final peace agreement. The idea was that those would be held for elections, which is very interesting and actually logically and inconsistent with how we would think about things logically. Civil wars start and end, start for very specific reasons. So it is logical to assume that the conclusion of a civil war would include elements of the resolution of those issues. That's not what we see in El Salvador. What we see is that the violence that had taken place to control the socioeconomic prowess of the oligarchy and to maintain military rule began to take primacy over everything. Nothing mattered. Like at the end of the day, security and reform of institutions took primacy over everything. So these are the elements we can see. I'm not going to walk you through them because you can read, but the idea is that there are very specific observable implications that we should see here. But what we actually see, interestingly enough, is a little bit different. In many respects, you see you see evidence of this. So for example, security sector reform, you see, the civilization of the National Intelligence Agency, you see an overall reduction in the size of the military, which is very interesting given that the United States had just paid a lot of money to make the military much larger. And the responsibility, no longer would the military be responsible for internal security, which was a complete shift. But what we also find is that certain things just didn't matter. Domestic spoilers, by this point, the appetite for continued fighting just simply wasn't there. The oligarchy didn't want it because they didn't think it served their economic interests any longer, and actually assumed that any further fighting would impair their hold on power, that they would have to make more concessions in the future. But also the people, like everyday Salvadorans, were not willing to join the FMLN or support the government because they, this was a 3 to 4 generations of active repression by the government and war fight, and 12 years of war fighting. People were tired. Everybody was really tired. And then what you saw, contingent foreign aid, external support for the FMLN dissolved because ultimately it became a party. It had what Sherry Zaks refers to as a successful rebel to party transition. But in that case, the US also conditioned its aid on the cessation of human rights violations. I have that in quotes because that had been something the United States had done through. The United States had alleged that it had conditioned its support for the Salvadoran government on human rights violations throughout the war. President Carter did that in the late 1970s, where there was just very little support given to El Salvador, military support given to El Salvador. That ramped up with President Reagan in the early 1980s. And there were times where in 1983, President Bush went to El Salvador and was very specific about the death squad killing needed to be reduced. You would, at that point, it was not abnormal to, for citizens to travel down roads and see bodies that had been discarded from death squads. There were body dumps that were well known throughout the country. The violence was palpable and visible. So what you ended up seeing, and work by Amelia Hoover Green actually demonstrates this, brilliant quantitative work. If you're interested in quantitative analysis of the violence in El Salvador, I highly recommend the work by Hoover Green and also her work with Patrick Ball and H.R. Dagg on that topic. But what she found was essentially there was a shift from observable violence by the security forces acting on behalf of the government. So observable violence and unobservable violence. So what you saw was a reduction in lethality. So killings went down, but at the same time, starting at about 1984, 1985, you saw unobservable violence go up. So what you saw were increases in torture. The highest reports of torture actually happened in 1989. So we're at the point where the end of the war is coming. And so you saw a shift and almost a replacement effect in lethal versus non-lethal violence. So torture went up, sexual assault, kidnapping, all of those went up as killing came down. But there was still a lot of killing. That is not to, please don't let me let you leave here without believing that there was not a lot of killing taking place, because there was. So what you saw there is that the United States conditioned aid on this, but this was the same language they used throughout the war, and it just wasn't, there was no teeth. There was not a lot of teeth to this condition. And then finally, the resolution of the natures under dispute. As I said, these were socioeconomic in nature. They remain unresolved to this day, and they were not addressed in the negotiations. So when I think about explaining El Salvador, I really look at these three factors: the security sector reform, the presence of a third-party guarantor to mediate those rounds, and not only mediate those rounds of negotiation, but then also monitor the compliance to those final provisions. So take, for example, the FMLN's transition to a party was predicated on their full disarmament and demobilization. And so while the ceasefire held throughout, there were some fits and starts. That was not, the FMLN was not perfect in terms of its disarmament and demobilization. There were times that caches were found in Nicaragua and Honduras that were FMLN caches. And for De Soto and his mediation team, they didn't think it was enough to blow up the agreement because there was progress being made. So it never fully, the agreement never fully exploded, but there were some fits and starts along the way. You had oversight bodies such as COPAS created to monitor some of that, but there were problems with it because it was comprised of 12 different organizations: civil society, government, the church. And essentially what you had were, there was never a way to, there was a uniform asymmetry across it, not in terms of people agreeing with everything, but they could never reach an agreement. So the UN mission was established to really help that. And so as I process traced, what I found was that these three variables actually tended to take primacy and actually help to explain what we see in El Salvador today. So then when I think about the FMLN's organizational design, as I mentioned, you had 5 revolutionary movements. Then they moved to one-ish rebel group. They weren't completely all there, but they had a command group, which were the leaders of each of these 5 groups that kind of spent all their time in Managua and Mexico City. But then, so you go from 5 to 1 political party. And that transition to a political party really tempered the ability for a new insurrection movement to start. The FMLN, it took the entire 1970s for the FMLN to actually come together as one organization. And so in terms of what it would take for a credible revolutionary movement to begin, and actually challenge the state right now, it would take a lot, and it's just not there. There are very few, there's no alternative right now there's no space for a revolutionary movement right now. So just that design, when you essentially, by bringing those 5 movements into one, and those 5 movements into one rebel group and then one political party, they can't operate, they're now one party, and there's an inability to mount a credible threat to the state through insurrection at this point. So when I look at explaining El Salvador, this is the wrong slide, so I apologize. But when I think about explaining El Salvador, I really look at those factors. But when I think about implications for scholarship, it's really very important, because when I think about how El Salvador has transitioned from, political violence to criminal violence with respect to the Maras and the gangs that are actually, that control so much of the country, it's fallen almost out of favor with political violence scholars studying contemporary El Salvador, because it's become criminal violence, and how we study that is very different. And so when we think about what what is happening in El Salvador. It's not peace, but we really don't have a good term for what's happening currently. And then when I think for policy and practitioners is whether or not Chapultepec is a model worth imitating. El Salvador was very unique. The durability of these accords, it would take a lot to mimic them, you know, from everything from the rebel group consolidating and making that successful rebel to party transition. So you have that to the geopolitical considerations. In 1989, the desire and the want for, you know, a leftist government to come to power in El Salvador and Central America, you know, another in Central America, just went away. The collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc states just made it geopolitically not feasible to continue to request, you know, to demand such things and to mount you know, a revolution based on that point. So there are some things that are very important here, but for the most part, we really need to think about that. And the final piece actually is we saw a disarmament and demobilization of the FMLN. We did not see a reintegration of those combatants into any sort of security apparatus. And this could have told us a lot this could have been the resultant violence and where those individuals found themselves in society could have told us a lot about the potential implications of de-Baathification in Iraq. And so El Salvador can tell us a lot, but how policy practitioners use it might be as a cautionary tale, vice a model worth imitating. And with that, I look forward to your questions and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Meg. And please go ahead and enter questions in the Q&A function. We already have a couple. And Meg, I think if you stop sharing your screen, I think it'll probably be easier to manage the Q&A. I'll go ahead and read the questions as they come in. So the first one is from one of our CSAC research fellows, postdoctoral fellows, Ryan Musto. He asks whether you could comment on the sources you used in your work. And basically, Ryan's interested in the state of the archives in El Salvador. How much access do you have to archives? A difference between government and civil society held archives. How do they compare to what the US archives say? And are there sources you still hope to consult or archives you'd like to get access to that you haven't been able to access yet?
Of course. And Ryan, I can also send you an email with my entire list of everything with contacts if that's something you're interested in. I'm more than happy to help you because I had many people helping me. I think the best archives that I found were those at the Museum of the Word and Image. Like, they're phenomenal. But what I found is that a lot of those archival collections have made their way into the United States. The University of Texas has I think the entire collection of radio archives from the radio station that was that was based in the mountains, that was actually a source of communications for the FMLN. I think that Hoover, of course, has exceptional archives in this and exceptional collections for a lot of the current government officials who were members of the FMLN. I look forward to getting into those a little bit more. I'm very hesitant with the US archives, the US government archives. You have to more than triangulate on those. You have to kind of take them as, I start with the process that there's a lot of hyperbole in them, and then try and build on those. So I don't tend not to I take them as, I take them with a grain of salt. I do. I think there are several collections at the University of Central America I'd like to get into a lot more. But I would say I just have a lot more. There's so many archives and collections. I want to get into more of them, but I'd rather depending on what your research what your research question is, mine depends a lot on those Spanish language archives that are in El Salvador. And I tend to use then the US government archives as a backdrop for what was going on in the United States, and not as evidence for what was happening with those conflict parties. I think that's the best way to think about those. But yeah, let's get in touch and I'll be more than happy to share my stuff with you. More than happy.
Thanks. Let's see. Aidan Millif says, really great presentation. Wants you to go more in depth in your implications slide. You point out, well, the Civil War hasn't restarted. It's hard to call El Salvador particularly peaceful. Can you talk about the connections between the political and criminal violence, and what role do ex-combatants play in this violence? What does the violence we see in El Salvador now, what are the implications for our current operating definitions of what constitutes a civil war?
This is problematic. El Salvador is not peaceful at all. The last time I was there, I was in a mall. There are lots of malls in San Salvador, lots of malls. And gunfire started going off in the mall. And I'm just not used to that. Like, it's just not what happens. And even in Philadelphia, that's not what happens. So I think that the implications, what they can tell us, is that we really need to look at how we transition out of these conflicts to ward off the criminal violence, because it's very similar to what we see in Iraq in certain circumstances. You raise a really good point that there are connections between particularly among the younger ex-combatants at the end of the Civil War to some of the early Maras, and what happened there. So we see a transition from the combatants who fought to some of those who became foot soldiers in the Maras. Now we're, of course, we're 30 years out. So that's not, you don't see that in the same way. And the Maras themselves have become very political. Like, they've become very political as well, and operate not with the tacit consent of the government, because the government could do more about them, but why? I do think that, I'm just looking at your question. I'm sorry, reflecting on how do you feel about, I have it. Conceptualization, this is where Sherry Zaks and I have like a field day about conceptualization, because I do think there's a problem with how we look at how we define civil wars. Do I have a better definition for you? No, sure don't. And it's not one that would hold up generalizably, because that's what we care about, like generalizability. But yeah, the conceptualization of civil war, when you look at a conflict like El Salvador, is problematic, is highly problematic, because it takes us away from political violence and kind of says, hey, criminologists, you look at this because this is your stuff. But in fact, there are major implications. I think Ben Lessing does some really great work on this at University of Chicago to really look at, and he considers it that way. And there's several other scholars, and Aidan, I'm more than happy to send you, I was actually just looking at one of the documents this morning, more than happy to send you some of that work, because there are more scholars that are looking at this and saying that this criminal violence should be considered, I am one of them, this criminal violence should be considered political violence as well.
Thank you. Next question is from Ashley Fabrizio in Stanford Political Science, and I might piggyback on our question too, using the moderator's privilege. Ashley asks, how was something as seemingly difficult as security sector reform, the disbanding units, reducing force levels, come about? Were security force leaders convinced to accept this or coerced by political leaders? And let me tag on to that. When you were speaking about the role of spoilers in your analysis of the Salvador Civil War case, you focused on the rebel spoilers, so to speak. And I'm wondering if you can tell the story, because I'm sure you know it, of why the military weren't spoilers. Because you did talk about the oligarchy military split and reference Bill Stanley's work, of course, but they seem to me like the logical spoilers on the government side. And maybe you can talk a little bit about why they weren't spoilers, and then why did they go along with the reforms as Ashley raises in her question.
So security sector reform is it's kind of like the dog trying to, chase a car. It's like, when you get there, what do you do? What do you do with it when you get there? And we actually see it for once in a place like El Salvador. It was difficult, but it was really at the point where they had no other option. The one external supporter they had, President Bush, was just not willing to, he wasn't totally on board with El Salvador getting as much support as they did during the Reagan administration. But when he came to power, he definitely was not on board with that. We see from 1990 to 1993, like a sharp, decrease in, not a sharp decrease, but a significant decrease in the amount of military support that El Salvador received. I think it really came to, there just was no other credible alternative for them. Reducing force levels, the disbanding the units, they knew that was coming. They knew that from 1980, they knew that had to happen, and we're just kind of holding on. I think they thought they were going to keep probably the national, the National Guard, not so much the Treasury Police, who were by far the most violent group, but the National Guard was right up there with them. It was a difficult, I made it seem like it was, I probably spoke of it as if it was a seamless transition. It was not. A lot of that was worked out in conversations about who would remain in power, among those negotiating, were you getting rid of foot soldiers or were you getting rid of officers? And that balance was struck over those negotiations. I know that's not a great answer, but it's just one where parties just felt like they didn't have a choice. Harold, with respect to your question, the pushback, the oligarchy felt like they, were better off. The military, there was pushback. If there was a spoiler to be had, it was going to be the military. If there was going to be a credible spoiler, it was going to be the military. In this case, it also came down to concerns about what external parties might do. They'd seen what had happened in Nicaragua. They'd seen what had happened in the Dominican Republic, and were worried about, are you perhaps going to, are we going to end up with Marines in our country if we don't do this? I think there's some measure of that. I do have some archival evidence that talks about those concerns. I don't think they were not the overarching concerns, but I think it did come down to, much like I said, with respect to Ashley's question, there was just no other choice. But if somebody was going to spoil, it was going to be the military.
Right. I think this is also an interesting to tie back to something else we were talking about, Meg, is when U.S. threats to withdraw support had teeth or did not have teeth. And certainly after the end of the Cold War, suddenly the threats of not supporting this anti-communist military force became much more credible under President Bush. I think that's a really good point.
I just want to say something a little bit more about this. When we're talking about proxy war and using the principal agent dynamic here, principal agent dynamics, it's an economic policy. So the idea is you can pay somebody into this, you could, pay somebody into preference alignment. But when you you only have but so many actors in, conflict that you can support, right? And the idea that you're going to have this misalignment, and you will have this misalignment, and there's only so much you can do. And the United States had to pick a side, and they only had the government to support because the Soviet Union, Cuba, and Nicaragua had already they'd already picked their horse. So there wasn't a choice for the United States until the fall of the Soviet Union.
I think that's a really good point. Let's move on to Everett Vieta, who thanks you for a great presentation, fantastic presentation. You've pointed to the uniqueness of the El Salvador case, but do you think your analytical framework can be exported to other cases? If so, what states or regions are you thinking about?
This is something, Everett, you actually touch on why I switched from, do I want to explain Civil War recurrence over non-recurrence overall, or do I want to explain it in El Salvador? I cared a lot about El Salvador, but I ultimately decided to go with the latter, like the more country specific focus, because I grow concerned about trying to find causal explanations across a myriad of conflicts that are by and large different, like that are just different for so many reasons. I think the best place that I could export this framework would be to another conflict that with underpinnings that were socioeconomic. Like this would not function for an ethnic war, a religious war, one over territory. Like it just wouldn't, and those are the limitations. Like it would have to be a conflict that was grounded in like the onset was a socioeconomic factor, and it would have to be and state repression, like the state repression as a tool. That would be the only sort of conflict that this would export to.
Thanks. Let's go on to a question from Melissa Carlson, one of our postdoctoral fellows here at CSAC. She says, fascinating presentation. 2 questions. First, I would love if you could speak more to how you think the presence of multiple rebel groups, rather than just one as in the case of El Salvador, impacts your findings about the factors that influence Civil War recurrence. Second, your discussion of the organizational characters. Sorry, I have to take a drink of water. Sorry about that. Second, your discussion of the organizational characteristics of the FMLN seems to suggest that the centralization of command in these groups impacts their use of violence post-conflict. Is this a correct interpretation? Could you elaborate a bit more on the FMLN commanders' ability to control their units' use of force?
So to the first question, multiple rebel groups, this would be, if these rebel groups were splinter groups from one, so fragmentation, if we'd seen fragmentation, that I would say you're often dealing with, in this case, if you looked at the difference between the ERP and the FPL, where one was very much, we want a political solution, and the other was much more insurrection minded. Those would be hard to rally around unless they unified. But the presence of multiple rebel groups always impacts your findings in this case. I would say in that case, you would have to, the nature of the issues under dispute would become much more important, because there's a reason why these groups are, particularly if they fragmented, there's a reason why they split, and that they didn't come together for unity of effort. They didn't consolidate at some point. I think that would be like, it would be highly problematic. And I think that the nature of the issues under dispute would have more leverage in that case, that they would become much more important. And spoilers, you have more spoilers, and that is highly problematic. So I just think that there would be more factors at play. What El Salvador, having the one group and the government, it actually made less factors salient. When you have those other groups, you're going to have to consider more of those factors. And I do think that the issues and the spoilers are going to really be problematic, as well as you then have to consider, depending on where it is, if there are ethnic groups and things like that, any cross-border, so neighbor issues might become more salient in this case, because neighbors and great power support often are in other wars become much more important, not as much in this case for the neighbors but I would say spoilers, issues related to cross-border issues, particularly related to ethnic ties and kinship ties might come into play, as well as, so the issues, spoilers, and potential kinship ties might come into play in that case. But when you talk about the organizational characteristics of the FMLN, the issue is that post-conflict, the FMLN did not any longer exist as a rebel organization. It became a political party. Yes, there was still opposition, but it wasn't rallying around the FMLN or any of those groups that comprised the FMLN. It just had no place to go in that case. So I do think that when I talked about that kind of held violence at bay, you just didn't have a group any longer. You did have fighters out there, but there was no unity of command for them. I do think that when you talk about the FMLN commander's ability to control the use of violence, that actually was more, if you look at it from a post-conflict environment, like they didn't exist as a rebel group. And in my interviews, combatants were very specific about talking about the historic FMLN, which was a revolutionary movement focused on justice. And once it became a political party, they were more concerned about power, from my in my interviews, I found that they were more concerned about power overall, political power in that respect. And for many of them, they felt that they were just like the military before, the maintaining, once they got into power, staying in power. And they did have early on great electoral success early on. So that was actually important. But, their ability to control their units' use of violence actually was an issue earlier, but that was tempered actually. And I argue this in my dissertation, ideologically. There were just some types of violence the group was unwilling to do. Like they were not going to, and you see this in Derek Cohen's book, they were not going to rape. They were not going to torture. Now they would kill you and disappear you. Like that is something that the FMLN would do, but they were going to be much more selective about it than the government. But there were just certain types of violence they were not going to do ideologically.
Thanks. And let's try to squeeze in a couple more questions, but I was just going to suggest to you that a nice way to contrast or explore the role of one group versus many groups is maybe the contrast with Colombia, where you also have a socioeconomic conflict that's rural-based, left-wing parties supported by many of the same external actors that you're talking about. But as the joke goes, Colombia is very good at negotiating peace, but it's not very good at implementing it. So it's been negotiating peace for like 50 years. Yeah. I think at one point I counted over 35 peace accords in Colombia.
Yeah.
Let me move on and take a question from Stephen O'Grady, and then we'll take one from Gabrielle Hecht. Okay. So Stephen O'Grady describes as a self-described archival researcher who was impacted by the lack of access to archives during the pandemic. What can be done, or what have you done to maintain remote access to specialized archival materials? And how, I think maybe a larger point to draw from Stephen's question is, what are your workarounds for the current pandemic time for being able to continue your archival work?
Well, I plan to be out at Hoover, for APSA, but that didn't happen. I think a lot of it is, and you'll be getting an email from me, Harold, in the next couple of weeks, about identifying on-site research assistants to help you and support you to go where you can't go right now. Like, so can't travel, but there are undergraduates at Stanford who are looking to make money, I suppose. So find them.
We can find some good ones. So.
And so that is how you do that. With respect to regions like El Salvador, if I wanted to do in-country, I had a wonderful fixer research assistant while I was there. And he's been lovely at helping me, anytime I needed something, going and doing that. The bigger issue there is how to get him paid. Like, that is something that we haven't fully figured out how to do that consistently, but those are the sorts of issues that you run into. And mobile money becomes a very attractive alternative. So in that respect, but then it becomes like at the university level, how do you get reimbursed and how do you ensure they get paid?
Yes.
So a lot of this has been the university stuff, but you find workarounds by using people who are closer to those archives than you are, and understanding you may not get what you hope and dream, and you may not get the brass ring you're searching for, but you'll get a really good ride on the carousel.
Great. It's a great analogy. Gabrielle Hecht here at CSAC, she says, speaking as a historian, I appreciate your rigorous use of archives. I wonder two things, and please forgive my methodological naivete with respect to political science. She asks, first, is process tracing a term that political scientists use when they're essentially conducting historical and archival work? If not, what's different about the method? And second, in your response about the question about broader applicability, you said your approach wouldn't apply to conflicts that didn't have socioeconomic origins. But can we say that conflicts over land, religion, and other things don't have socioeconomic origins? Aren't conflicts usually about a lot of interrelated things?
Gabrielle, you're absolutely right. I would never say that that conflicts with those origins were not about socioeconomics as well, particularly when you're talking about territory. Those are usually always have some sort of socioeconomic issue associated with them. So in that case, I spoke too broadly and too generally. I think in this case, I think El Salvador is so unique because it only really had of course, there were some land reform issues, but those in and of themselves were socioeconomically based. So they weren't territory in the same sense that I'm thinking territory in the broader sense. But no, you're absolutely correct in that regard, is that these conflicts are always about more than just one thing. The origins of them are, because when you think about it, if you really go back for El Salvador, you have the issue with indigenous populations, so there is always an element at play. With respect to process tracing, no, that's not the case, because process tracing can also be, and others do this, Cherry Zaks, Theo Milanopoulos, and others do quantitative process tracing. So there can be a quantitative element. It is really working, the way I look at it is really working through, when I do it, it's really working through the evidence over time to identify those causal mechanisms, like what has happened over time. It is the closest I think that my work comes to what historians do, but I don't know your methods well enough to, speak on that. But I think I like to pretend like I'm a closet historian when I do the type of process tracing I choose to do. I don't do Bayesian process tracing often, but when I do it, that is a very different type of process tracing. So I think that the method can be used, if you're going to use that method, it can be used to do causal analysis. In a way, I tend to just look at it and to look for broader themes and things like that to discuss, but it is similar. There are overlaps in the historical archival work, but it is not necessarily, political scientists who use archives don't always use use process tracing to interrogate those archives. There are a host of things that they can do, but that's how I choose to interrogate some of my archival work, but I use it in conjunction with other types of evidence as well.
Great. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. So everyone, if you could please join me in thanking Meg Gulliford for a great presentation today and for sharing some of her research with us. Thank you so much, Meg.
Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.